Hi, this is Doug Bay, and welcome to video 3B in our Churchill River Proposed Projects series. And today what we're going to do is to examine Hydro-Quebec's exports. We'll look at both volumes and prices. We're going to begin this video by looking at a chart which should be familiar to you, which involves domestic production in the orange here, and the availability of electricity in Quebec, which is the green area here. So this is demand, this can be looked at supply, and the difference between these two are net exports. Realizing, of course, that it may be that Hydro-Quebec, even with the same state or province, can be both exporting and importing at the same time. In this chart, we are looking at where the exports go, either to the United States or to other provinces. So the total amount of exports, not net exports, but total exports, is given by the gray line. You'll notice that the amount of power, total amount of power which is being exported, is going down over time and has continued to go down. And the reasons for this we've discussed in the previous video, but as no doubt you'll realize by this time, it's due to the drought. Back here, the blue line represents the power going to the United States. And that's certainly above the power which was exported to the other provinces, primarily New Brunswick. Well, this line is going down, but in fact, it's going down more rapidly. In other words, the amount of power going to the free markets in the United States around June of this year is below the power going to other provinces, as I've said, primarily New Brunswick. That's because New Brunswick has long-term relationships with Hydro-Quebec. But notice that we have Quebec's reputation is as a power exporting province. But when you look at the total amount of power available, it's exporting less than 5%. And down here is probably exporting to the United States 1.5%. Which is quite surprising because Hydro-Quebec has spent a lot of money putting new transmission lines both into the New England ISO through Maine and to New York. So these have been heavy investments which presumably are not really being used. This diagram was produced by the United States Energy Information Administration, better known down there as the EIA. It focuses on electricity trade between the Eastern connections and both in terms of imports, which are down here between Hydro-Quebec and primarily the New England ISO, new transmission line in there, as we just mentioned, and the New York ISO down here. That imports, a lot of imports from Quebec. It should be noted that the imports into the United States, into New York from Hydro-Quebec, this lighter shade of red, I guess, then the dark shade is greater than the imports into New England. They're hoping to, but all that changes, doesn't it, when we get down to 2023 and the famous drought. Most of the imports are coming in through New York, and here, New England, in the darker red, is exporting into Quebec. Transmission lines supposed to take power from Quebec into New England, but instead they're taking power from New England into Quebec. In this diagram, also from the EIA, It looks at exports and imports and the prices there. And this is when they say this is from down here, the exports are going to the east of Canada. Where's the east of Canada? That's Ontario, Quebec, into the Maritimes, and Newfoundland, Labrador. Same thing, that the imports are coming from the east, primarily from Quebec and Ontario, but some from New Brunswick too. Okay, so here we want to focus on the prices, that is the dollars per megawatt hours, and you see they move around. They've been increasing in terms of exports from the United States, getting a bit higher here. Looks like it's getting up to about what? Top green line here around October, $140 per megawatt hour. Would that be about 14 cents per megawatt hour? Here they're importing power. So this would be the exports from Canada into the United States, the imports to the United States, into the United States from this American point of view, and a fair amount of movement around here. Particularly, you'll see that the fair spikes. Here it's over 15 cents per kilowatt hour, or $150 per megawatt hour. Here's quite high too. So we'd like to find out a little bit more about that. The other thing we'd like to find out about, but I couldn't get access to, is when you import and export power from provinces, between provinces, what are those prices? We showed you what the exports and imports were, but you'd like to know about the prices. Well, Hydro-Quebec, New Brunswick Energy, Newfoundland and Labrador knows what those are. Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro knows what those are, but they're not sharing it with us. So it's a bit strange. You're trying to examine what's going on, but you can't get a hold of the information that you'd really like to. So here, using the data, I think the volume data are going to be fairly accurate, because the Canada Energy Regulator shares that data with Statistics Canada. The thing to note here are the exports from, in megawatt hours, from Quebec, QC, into New York. It's been going up there. We hit 22, 23, big dive down. And then the exports from, we've talked about the exports from Quebec into New England ISO, they go down. And here, 23, they're virtually non-existent. What about what's Newfoundland and Labrador doing? Well, that's in the gray and the dotted gray line. So the gray line, which solid gray line here, which is Newfoundland and Labrador into New York, that seems to be steady. Drop down here, but now it's picking back up. But on the other hand, where are they shipping into? Well, Quebec wasn't shipping into New England, but guess which province is? Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's gone up, which is a very interesting pattern. In this chart, I want to look at the export prices into selected American markets through Quebec. The prices I have here are Canadian dollars per megawatt hour, and we'll see that the blue line here is associated with Hydro-Quebec, and the gray line and the dotted line is associated with Newfoundland and Labrador, and the solid gray line is the Newfoundland and Labrador hydro going into New York, and the dotted one is going into New England ISO. These data come from Canada Energy Regulator, which I mentioned in a previous video, is sometimes their data seems a little bit inconsistent. I think the volume data are good, but the price and value data seem to be sometimes at odds with patterns. that we see here? Well, they seem to be following somewhat similar patterns. But also we see the existence of dynamic pricing, and that is pricing which is seasonal pricing. So high in January, maybe a little bit high here in July, August, high in January, and then July, August, high again in January, and you'll see here is July and August, and then high in January again. Here we want to notice that, well, what's the price per kilowatt hour? Well, here from Hydro-Quebec going into Maine are pretty close. It was over actually $192.53. They were from power from Newfoundland and Labrador going into the New England ISO. So what would that be in kilowatt? Not in dollars, but in cents. So it'd be about 19.24 cents. Given the low price to produce electricity, which was around 0.3 of a cent, and they were selling it for almost half a cent, 0.48 or so. That's quite a spread there from 0.3 or half a cent, which is selling in some markets they're getting from Hydro-Quebec, to when you go into New England, you're getting 19 cents. That's a fair spread. Just to show that some of the data I was dealing with, let's go to the next slide. That's this one, where again we're looking at market prices, but now I'm looking at Hydro-Quebec going into New York. Well, you see much more of you see the up and down, but much more of a crazy pattern, and sometimes a suspect pattern. So do I really believe, what time is this? In June of this year, that they were selling, Hydro-Quebec was selling prices into New York at $265.12 and 12 cents per megawatt hour. That's 26.5 cents per megawatt hour. Well, I realize, because I've got family in Boston, that the price of electricity to them is around 43 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's US, so that's more than Canadian. And so that's pretty high. One of the reasons why you might want to use peak load pricing, and you might want to save water in your reservoir so you can get the highest price. The point here, when you're going into these export markets, whether they're Canadian or certainly American, which is a very free market, that the prices can vary per day. But when you go in, or over the months, as we've seen various times during the month, but what we've also seen is that Hydro-Quebec becomes a profit maximizer. To a certain extent, so does Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro. If they don't have to sell to Quebec, and Quebec doesn't want the power and they can sell it, then sell it into those American markets. But Hydro-Quebec uses this strategy and talks about it in the reports how they've used this strategy to make a substantial profit. Even when the amount of electricity is going down, the profit they're reporting is going up. Why? Because the prices that they're getting for their electricity over time are going up. Partially, you think, because the source of how they generate the electricity in New England and New York, which are natural gas turbines, increases, but so is the demand increasing. Well, that's enough about electricity. Well, that's it for export prices and volumes, primarily into the United States. And what we've seen is that, well, volumes are going down, prices are going up, and therefore for Hydro-Quebec, profits are also up. The other thing we want to note here is that the prices which you can get for your electricity, vary throughout the months of the year and are particularly high in January and February and fall down, but then can rise a little bit in July and August. So the strategy which you might want to do is to use your reservoirs as huge storage batteries and generate power when you can get the highest price for them. Our next video will have to do with royalties. Anyways, thanks for watching.